What's up, guys? Joey here. So I've been running AMD for a while now, from an RX 5700 and now RX 6700 XT, and also from Intel i7 6700K to Ryzen 3600 and now 5600X. And part of being a PC enthusiast and just computing in general is that you will run into things you need to troubleshoot to keep the system running smoothly, and then the only deciding factor is whether you go through a PC tech store or RMA your hardware. If you want to assume like I'm not like bagging on anyone that actually does have genuine RMA necessity, where you've just bought the card and it's not functioning correctly, it's crashing constantly, and nothing you do will fix it. Even a performance tuning profile does not alleviate the problem. But there are some things you can definitely troubleshoot on the user end and resolve completely without having the RMA. So one thing I wanted to kind of do is, because so many people, like, it's kind of widespread and it's a little bit annoying because it's partially AMD's fault for not being more conservative with their clock speeds and the way the BIOS reads or the way the drivers, I should say, the Radeon software reads the BIOSes. If some genius on the AMD driver team wanted to fix a lot of the stability problems, all they would have to do, and this is I legit believe this would be the fix for a lot of people, is lower their target boost clocks by 50 to 100 megahertz. And I think most people having black screens, driver timeouts, driver crashes, the driver icon just randomly restarting, which I have experienced all of it, and I've troubleshooted all of it and don't have it anymore. And that's how I know, because it's not like, even though it might sound a little anecdotal, I'm just a small YouTuber, just a single person, and I don't have a huge range of cards, but I have specifically encountered the black screens, the crashing, and the driver's issues, the duplicating icon, all the stuff people are complaining about. I had it on an RX 5700, and I managed to resolve it through tuning profiles and repasting my cards. So that was kind of on the RMA side, although I believe I could have done it through tuning and undervolting alone. But I saw the same behavior between the card BIOS and what the driver was showing me when I go to the performance tuning tab in here. And I'm going to show you guys this firsthand so you can understand what I mean. And if you understand what's going wrong, you've got a much better chance of fixing it. And you might feel like, oh, well, whatever. Because the thing is, the issue could be blamed on AMD, but it could also be blamed on the add-in board partners. So by add-in board, I mean whichever brand card you have, Gigabyte, MSI, Asus, their BIOSes are also tuned too aggressively. That they're not all stable because of the way that it interacts with the driver. So I'll show you what I mean here. If I go into my driver and advanced control, I'm not actually overclocking. So this is under the performance tab. You've got to enable custom tuning here on the right. And this is not to overclock or undervolt. This is to see what the card is running by default. So if I open GPU tuning enabled, I haven't actually said anything. I haven't done any overclocking. Advanced control will show me what the driver is defaulting to at 100% and for the minimum frequency, which is your hardware acceleration frequency for doing light loads like browsing. And this is where a lot of people are getting crashes too. If I enable this, I'll see what the card's giving it at stock. Now, I've already tweaked mine for 100% stability, so I can do anything on this computer and I will not get crashes. I can load browsers, Discord, light applications, heavy applications, nothing crashes on the driver level or on this GPU level. If I do happen to get a crash, the only crash I've ever really experienced in the recent months is a wee error when I updated my BIOS and I had to retune the undervolt of my CPU for stability. But that's getting off topic, and that's to do with, because you can stress test a CPU all day, and then when you undervolt, you're throwing off the lower voltage range as well, and so you can be stable on max load, but then at light loads you'll get a wee error, and it's actually undervolting instability. But anyway. So my default was more like this, 2689 megahertz on max frequency, and the minimum was down here at 500 megahertz. And even just sliding these around without hitting apply, I'm not actually doing this, I'm just giving you an idea of what the card was reading by default. Now, that might seem fine to some of you because, the card can go all the way up to 2950, but the thing is, the voltage curve is what's important. The stock voltage was 1200 MV, and the default was 2689. But the thing is, when you're unstable, when you have an instability, it only takes 10 megahertz to go from stable to unstable. So if my default max frequency was 2689, is that what my card was like, you know, if you're thinking about RMAing, because there are likely people RMAing because of this exact issue, and that is whatever BIOS Gigabyte sent with my card has the wrong max frequency, and the driver kind of like does a good job of getting it lower, but it doesn't get it all the way down to what should be the advertised frequency range. And by advertised range, I mean if I look at my exact model card, so you can Google your card, bring up the specification sheet for whatever brand card you have. The game clock is 2514, so that's usually what'll, based on temperature and whatever frame rate you're running and your CPU. This game clock here is not really accurate. It's just an average expected game clock. So you don't go by that. Go by the boost clock. So whatever the boost clock is, up to 2622 megahertz on my card is what I should be seeing in the max frequency of the driver. Not the max, like if I want to overclock it further and like, you know, try to run it faster than advertised, but the default should be down at 2622. And if it's going over that, it only takes, like if you overclock a lot, you'll know. Once you are at your stable limit, it only takes 10 megahertz or 20 megahertz, and once you're over that limit, you'll get crashing and you'll get artifacting and things like that. It can manifest in different ways. But more importantly, not just the max frequency, but the minimum frequencies are too aggressive for hardware acceleration. I do think they do, like a lot of people would get better stability for browsing and streaming and things like that for light usage with a higher minimum frequency. But here's where the things go wrong. You could know all this and you think, okay, well, the solution is simple. I just tune it to more stable settings and save a power profile, like save a overclock profile in the driver. And that will be stable for the time that you're running the card. Like in most cases, it'll stabilize the card so you can start browsing, your driver won't crash and things like that. But here's what will go wrong. You'll assume there's a problem with the card because when you reboot, you'll have your performance tuning profile set, and you might assume because you've set that and it loads automatically on boot up that your card's going to be stable on boot up, but it's not, because in the time it takes the driver to load, and I've watched this, like the driver icon does not appear straight away, right? The driver has to load itself, and then there's a moment where it has to load your performance tuning profile. And what can happen is on boot up, before your performance tuning settings that are stable have loaded, the driver will crash because it's running off your unstable settings. It'll initially load off the BIOS. So whatever your BIOS, your GPU BIOS has, it'll load that briefly. And then if you get a crash in that moment at boot up, what'll happen is the driver icon, the driver's already crashed, it'll automatically recover. You might not even notice that there was a duplicate icon. You'll just see the single icon and assume everything's golden. And then you'll be playing a game with your stable undervolt that or underclock, whatever you've put. And then suddenly it'll crash or black screen or whatever. And then when you go to check the driver, it'll say the driver has crashed and recovered. But what actually happened is that can happen at boot up. You just didn't notice it. You didn't notice the driver had crashed and recovered until it actually caused a physical symptom. And what happens when it crashes at boot up is you'll be back at stock settings and your performance tuning profile never actually loaded in the first place. It'll be like this, like at your whatever your unstable defaults are. So to demonstrate that further, or to elaborate further, the reason RMA helps is because, one, sometimes you get a better quality card from the factory, which means the voltage range is more stable because it can handle that extra 50 megahertz the driver is giving it. So even though like my GPU actually crashes at stock settings, if I leave it on default without the fixes that I've done, 2689 will crash. And if I RMA'd this card, I might get a card with a slightly better quality silicon, and it can handle 2689 at 1200 MV. But mine does not handle 2689 at 1200 MV, but it'll be fine for 2600. So 80 megahertz less, because the voltage curve is sharper the higher you go. At 2600, I can run 1163 MV, and it's stable. So yeah, that's the reason RMAing works, because RMA has a chance of getting you better quality silicon. You might get a better thermal paste application from factory, so your delta between the current and the junction is smaller, and that will also help with stability. So if you're, higher overclock that would have been slightly unstable with a bad delta, it can be more stable because you've got a better pasted card. So that just comes down to luck as well. But usually there's a margin, like I'd say up to 90C junction under load is fine for stability purposes. But AMD's like official response is up to 110C is within spec. But that does not mean that every single person can run 110C stable. There are certain cards that they'll just crash over 90C. My RX 5700, when I repasted it because the junction delta was huge, my initial repaste wasn't perfect, and I was getting 95C spikes into the hotspot range, and it was already crashing. Like the screen would go black. The highest temperature I'd see is 90C, right? It's not getting up to 100C, but it was crashing in games and black screening on me, and then I'd hear the fans ramp up, and that was classic. If you hear the fans ramp up when the black screens, that is your hotspot. Like somewhere on the card, it might not necessarily show up in a reading, in a temperature readout, because it happens too quickly, but it's spiking past the safety temperature, past 110, and you're not seeing it. So if that's happening to you, then that's where an RMA will definitely help in that case, because the card isn't supposed to be spiking past the maximum safe limit. So in explaining that, I'm just going to show you now so you get a rough idea. My card was defaulting to around 2689 at full stock at 100%, like the 100% reading. Now, my card's advertised for 2622, and here's where I'm going to show you where the issue seems to be. Is there's a tool called More Power Tool, and what this tool does is it lets you rip your BIOS. Well, not the tool itself. You also got to use a separate program, GPU-Z, to get your GPU's BIOS. But it can edit your BIOS and load settings into the registry that the driver will read on boot up. And that's the best way I can explain it, is that on boot up, you can have your stable settings loading before the drive. Like the first thing the driver loads is these settings, rather than briefly loading the wrong settings. Now I'll show you what my card's default BIOS actually looks like, because I've ripped it from the card already. This is my default BIOS, navi22.rom, from my 6700 XT. And this is what the default frequency is actually showing the driver, 2854, not 26, not 2680. It's actually defaulting to 2854, and I'm not even talking about the OC limit, which is 2950. I can still go up to 2950. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean that the driver itself is seeing a BIOS that's trying to run up to 2854 megahertz on the max frequency. And the driver, to be honest, to AMD's benefit, the driver itself is actually doing a good job to default down to 2689, which is what I was getting when I checked what the default was. It was actually doing pretty good to bring it down from 28, right? But in reality, it should have been 2622. And in here should have been 2622 for my advertised card. And that's also where RMAing can help. The initial BIOS that the cards come with can sometimes be like a beta, not a beta, but an early BIOS. And then when you RMA, you have a chance that you'll get a more up-to-date BIOS with the exact same model card from their factory. So that's another thing. I can't get into specifics. I don't know if they do it in batches. There could be an early batch on initial release where your BIOS isn't as optimized as a later BIOS. And then when you RMA, you get the better BIOS card, so it fixes your problem. Sometimes it doesn't fix it anything because you get the same batch, or you get the same BIOS version that has this weird discrepancy with the boost clock, and the GFX clock when you check the BIOS is like up at some stupid number. Like it shouldn't even be past 2700, to be honest. And anyway, so that's what my BIOS was showing me. And the way to get your GPU BIOS is you download that GPU-Z. And GPU-Z, I can't do it live because I'm ReLive recording, and it actually blocks the app from ripping the BIOS. But this will let you copy the BIOS from your GPU like BIOS chip to a file. So you're not editing your actual BIOS. You're not doing a BIOS mod. You're just doing a soft mod that goes through the registry. It's all software based. So you save that to file, and then you load it up in MPT, load up the ROM, and go see what it is. Check your frequency, what it's defaulting to. And as well go into your fan. You can also adjust the fan curve. So the stock fan curves are actually very relaxed. This is my stock BIOS. It has a default target temperature of 80°C, which will obviously, if I don't set a fan curve, it'll obviously let the card get very warm, and it'll only run up to 1800 RPM until 80°C. So the acoustic limit basically means when the card's under load for a certain target graphics clock, the fan will only start to spin up when it's throttling. Like it can hit up to 4000 RPM for my particular card, and its throttling RPM to keep noise down is 3360 RPM. Max RPM and throttling RPM. So yeah, 80 degrees is a very high temperature in my opinion, and I actually have better results keeping that down at 50°C, but that's me. It's a personal preference. I prefer low temps over a little bit of noise. And then what I do is I set the acoustic limit to about 3200, which is just slightly audible for my 4000 RPM fans. And my fans get noticeably loud at around 3250 RPM and onwards. So up here, and at 4000, they're like jet engines, right? But I only set it to like this. And then I set this down to 3250 because that's the max tolerable limit. And my actual, oh, sorry, not 3250. My acoustic limit, which is what the fans will spin up to just under a light load, under a gaming load, I set that to about, I think it's 2850, something like that. So it's still only like, it's not near 100% of the fans because the fans got to 4000 RPM. So anyway, you can adjust that. You can turn off 0 RPM if that bothers you. It won't even show up in the driver anymore if you disable it here. And yeah, just set your temperature target. And the other thing is there's also another thing called target graphics clock. This is for hardware acceleration and medium loads. And it also affects how the fans behave. So if your minimum frequency, you like to bump it up to 1500 megahertz for stability under light games like League of Legends or hardware accelerated browsing and watching YouTube, for example. If you like to have it bumped up a little bit, match the target graphics clock to the same here. So it's 1500 target graphics clock, and that just helps with the fan behavior. But it's just my anecdotal. It's just what I've done, and my card runs 100% stable with the little tweaks I've done. Okay, and then I set this to 2600, so I round it down from the advertised 2622. I round it down to 2600, and then I go into power, this is basically the slider here, the voltage slider. And I default it to a slight undervolt at 1163. But I did stability test this using the normal performance tuning. So before I made the more power tool profile, I tested all these settings thoroughly under load, under superposition, GPU benchmarks. When I was sure they were stable, 1163 stable for the max frequency of 2600, then I loaded it as a more power. So after I've tweaked those settings, this is what then you hit save and you save a file. It's called an MPT file. And this is what my MPT profile looks like. Power 1162. Frequency max 2600, minimum 2500. This is for better performance, but if you want a bit of power saving, you could set it down to 2000. It just depends. If you're getting slight, if you're CPU bound, especially, if your CPU is not strong enough for the GPU to max it out, setting this a bit higher can help. When you're running lowered settings like competitive settings in a game, having this higher will just stop the clock dropping so much based on the CPU utilization and being CPU bound. So it's just a recommendation of what I would do, but if you're trying to save power, 2000 or 1500 also run stable. And that will just help with hardware acceleration stuff. When you're alt-tabbing out and using the browser, a lot of people do have out-of-the-box instability when doing light browsing and things like that. And that's where the minimum helps for stability. And then I don't touch anything else. Don't touch any of the voltage if you don't know exactly what you're doing, because you can literally brick your card. Not permanent brick, but you'd brick it from booting Windows because it'll try to load these settings out of the gate. So you'd have to literally format your system or find a way to disable the more power tool, maybe booting into safe mode and then deleting SPPT. That will delete the profile and go back to defaults, right? If you happen to mess with something. But just if you avoid touching anything else, you should be fine. It's just this Vmax under power, minimum and max frequency, and then your fan targets, and you can see what I've set my fan up like. So I've got my target graphics clock at my minimum frequency, 0 RPM is disabled. My target temperature is 50C because I play middle range games, like I play Diablo Immortal, for example, at 150 FPS, and I like to keep my temperature from climbing up into the 70C range on hotspot. If I happen to accidentally uncap the FPS or whatever, this just keeps it running nice and cool, and I don't mind a little bit of fan noise. So that's why I set it up to the acoustic limits to 850, because that is virtually inaudible with the PC sitting 4 feet away from me on the table. Okay? And you will just have to adjust based on your noise tolerance, your background noise. I have a ceiling fan over my head, which actually means I'm not as bothered by a little bit of case noise as someone else might be. Okay? So after you've done all that, then you save it, and then to enable it, you write SPPT, and it'll write it to the registry, and then hit exit and reboot the system. And then when you load the drivers up after doing that, you'll notice that if you go and I'll discard these changes, now my defaults when for example, I just hit default tuning, right? If I go into custom tuning to see what the GPU is doing out of the box, like out of the gate, and I go to advanced, my default minimum frequency, and you can see here, the 0% minimum frequency, which normally would be down at 500, is now at 2500. And the max frequency, 100%, is at 2600, and the voltage as well for 100%. It actually turns into my max voltage is 1163. And that basically fixes it across the range so that 2600 at 1163, and that's stable across all types of loads, 10% load, 20% load, whatever amount of load, it's stable. And yeah, that's what I do. And then there's a few other things that you might want to know is initially when I first got my first 5000 series card, there was a black screen issue where the monitor would desync. Now it was initially there was a certain driver version that had issues with virtual super resolution. That would actually cause a black screening, and disabling virtual super resolution was one fix. And as you can see, these are my GPU scaling settings for reference if you're trying to copy me. And the other factor was the PCIe mode, which you can see in GPU-Z. Cap it, or not cap it, fix it to whatever your board supports as the max frequency, especially if you're getting low usage crashes. I don't think this is necessary in 22.8.1. They might have fixed it at some driver version, but it has been an intermittent thing that has come back, like when I don't set up my MPT profile after driver update, because you have to reload this profile. If I don't reload this and I let the driver run stock without an MPT profile, say, let's just say I update to 22.9, whenever that releases, the normal process is I'll update the driver and then I'll reboot the system, go into here and load my MPT profile settings, write SPPT and exit, and then reboot again. And that is how I make sure the MPT is loaded and my card's going to be stable. If I just update to 22.9, or because this has been an ongoing thing, if I just update the driver and don't load my MPT, I get crashes and all sorts of things. And that's where this is just one little extra step that might help stability is go into your BIOS and find where your PCIe mode is set. And normally it's on auto. Set it to the max specification of your board. So if you're on B450 like me, set it to 3.0. If you're on B550, set it to 4.0. But the main thing is don't let it automatically clock up and down. Because if it's set to auto, what it'll do is at idle or at low loads, it'll drop to 1.0. And I believe there's just some bug somewhere that for some people that'll cause a crash when you're switching between low and high load. Like you're alt-tabbing, for example, between a game and the browser, and the game's in full screen exclusive mode. Then it's going from 4.0 suddenly down to 1.0 and back and forward. And just doing that too much will eventually cause some kind of instability crash. So yeah, I've got mine locked to 3.0. That's the other thing. And yeah, that's basically the rough breakdown of what I've done to stabilize my driver. And then there's a few just basic things. Avoid using too many of the different functionalities together. So I've been running Radeon Chill for Diablo Immortal. And what that does is it limits the FPS based on mouse movement. And it's actually really cool. I didn't use it for a long time because it was buggy when I first got my 5700. But on the RX 6700 XT, it seems to be good with the latest drivers on 22.8. But basically what this does is it will lower the FPS and GPU power consumption to a target frame rate when you let go of the mouse, when you're not pressing buttons. So if you get up to get a drink, instead of running at 160 FPS for your competitive game, it'll just go down to whatever FPS based on your monitor refresh rate and your personal preference. If you set this too low, this can cause stutters when you stop and start when you're moving around a lot. So if it's a game where you camp a corner, like CSGO or something, do not set it down to like 60 FPS as when you're AFK, because you'll actually be sitting there not doing any input when you're watching a corner, right? So you'd set it to something closer to your max refresh rate. You might have it, if you go to 144 hertz monitor, you might set it to 150, something like that. And then when you're actually playing, walking around and you need to do your flick shots, then have it up at 300 for a competitive title. Or for, depending on your monitor refresh rate though. My monitor refresh rate is only 100 hertz. So at idle, when I leave the computer, I don't mind it going down to 105. And then that just stops it. If I set it under my refresh rate, that's when I'll get tearing or something when I go from idle to using the PC, from AFK to coming back. And then I set my max FPS to something higher just because the game behavior of Diablo Immortal itself, it runs smoother above 130 FPS. So there's actually settings in that game where the max FPS cap in the game menu is 120, and then you can run uncapped. And I noticed that 120 has micro stutter. And then so if I capped it to 130, the game felt smoother. But then up at 150, the minimums were better, like the 1% lows and everything. So I actually have it capped up all the way up at 165 in the driver, but then I use Riva Tuner and cap the FPS in-game to 130. And yeah, that sounds kind of complicated, but long story short, I'm just using a combination of both of these so that if I accidentally forget about capping. Like sometimes I uncap my FPS when testing in ReviTuner. I've got a hotkey that uncaps it. If I forget to recap it and I go into Diablo Immortal will cap itself to 165 FPS. But normally I use 130 for Diablo Immortal just for that smoother gameplay. And yeah, this is like a backup FPS cap, basically. So I could set this to whatever I wanted. And then there's also, what is it, down here, frame rate target control, which works just like Radeon Chill. It just caps your FPS, but it does not have the minimum. So basically, it'll run up to your FPS cap at all times. But the main issue I have with this one is that you don't get any idle power savings. So if you go get a drink, if you're AFK, like unexpectedly, if you get interrupted a lot, you've got kids, you'll just be running at full throttle of whatever your frame rate, your max FPS target is at all times, and you don't get any power saving, which for some of us that matters. So yeah. Now, apart from that, the only thing I can advise is avoid using too many combinations of different things. So don't use like anti-lag plus chill plus boost plus, enhanced sync. You'll end up more or less, some games will have issues, and they even mention it in the driver notes that certain settings will cause issues in some titles. So minimize your use of these, and if you do run into issues with a particular game, especially black screening, disable some of these settings, and especially enhanced sync and fast sync. If you're using FreeSync, enhanced sync, any of the syncing, and you're getting black screens, disable all that syncing while you're troubleshooting. That will help you isolate the issue to whatever's causing it. Like you don't want to focus on your temperatures, but you've had FreeSync enabled the whole time, and it was FreeSync with that particular game causing the problem. And you might find that disabling the sync is perfectly fine for that title, and you don't get any tearing. It just really depends. And you can also prevent screen tearing just using FPS caps set at the right number. So if your monitor is 144 hertz and you're getting tearing uncapped, capping it to 140, which is like a minor, like you're not going to get huge input latency increase from doing that. Capping it to 140 will fix that screen tearing problem. So there's just different things you can do. But yeah, just to give you that rough idea of how I set my drivers is that's the main thing. And as well, under the performance advisors tab, because this is bloatware to me. I don't actually like the metric stuff, because this is for running, if you want to use the AMD OSD and you don't use ReviTuner, you can actually just get these to come up in your game, all these metrics it'll add, but it adds bloat. Like you're reading sensors, and when you add more sensor readings, it's kind of adding micro load to the CPU. Like it's adding minor load that you don't need, especially if you have your own, like you're using MSI Afterburner OSD. Don't run both, obviously. That's just common sense. But some of these are enabled by default, and don't. The other thing is you might even accidentally start logging if you're using hotkeys. And I saw someone, they had like 15 gigabytes of log files because they didn't realize that they'd been logging their sensors. So to avoid that, disable all the sensors, and then under the settings cog hotkeys tab, to avoid accidentally logging all your sensor readings for months, like it would just keep logging it every time you turn the computer on. But delete the hotkey, like click it and delete it, because the default is, it's possible you might accidentally hit the default, and just delete anything you don't want accidentally turning on and off. As you can see here, I've got like a bunch of the hotkeys disabled and there's none. Okay, so that's one other thing. And then this isn't really needed for stability, but I'm going to share this anyway. There is a, well, actually, this one is needed. For 22.8.1, there's a major bug. If you missed my video about it, there's a bug with VSync where if you normally had always on, so wait for vertical refresh, VSync always off, if you had it on always off and then you updated from a previous driver to 22.8 and you didn't do a factory reset, it'll still be set to always off. And what happens is there's a bug in the driver where it will uncap videos. So you're playing a video on YouTube, for example, instead of capping to your refresh rate, which is what they're supposed to do, hardware accelerated videos and things like that, media, Playback is supposed to capture your monitor refresh rate within the browser. And if it's uncapped, it skyrockets and just like overloads the frame buffer, and you'll get like basically your system will crash. Your GPU buffer will be overloaded, your cache, and it'll just stutter and crash the system if you don't hit the Windows key desktop. Windows key D will get you back to the desktop to avoid the crash. But the fix is to just not have it on always off, have it to off unless application specifies, and that fixes the hardware acceleration VSync issue. It'll let it cap the FPS on videos, and or any of these, but that'll basically turn on for all applications, or on and less application. It's the same thing. You basically just want the browser to be able to turn on VSync, and this turns it off in the browsers and in hardware acceleration. So that fixes that playback crash. If you're getting audio stutters on 22.8.1, that fixes it. And then there's a couple other things that are kind of niche, but for the sake of optimization, I'm going to share them as well. And one is beyond the metrics logging, there's also, if you go into here, and I hate this integration because I like to do all my CPU tuning from the BIOS. Now, if I go into my performance tuning tab, you might have noticed I don't have any Ryzen Master CPU integration, but I'm running a 5600X and the latest drivers. That's because they integrate the Ryzen Master SDK as a task. And that's actually a really good thing because it lets us disable it. And to disable it, you open Task Scheduler, go to your Task Scheduler library, and you'll see it up here at the top. Ryzen Master SDK task. This is what integrates it with your GPU driver. And right-click and disable that. And it will disable Ryzen Master and then restart the system. And then you won't get this CPU monitoring coming up in here. And if you don't use the CPU monitoring, that's actually preferred because then it's not going to interfere. Like it's adding bloat, basically. You don't want bloat. So you're not adding all this CPU sensor that you're not using. And it looks cleaner as well. Like when you go to check your GPU details, you're not getting the CPU coming up above it. Okay, so that's one more thing. And the other thing is with 22.8.1, this is part of the reason I think for the weird VSync bug with audio playback and the uncapping of the FPS, the hardware acceleration bug, is they've added that audio, what's it called? It's in here somewhere. I'll find it in the graphics tab maybe. They've added audio something or other under one of these settings. Audio and video, sorry. Audio noise suppression. And if you already have your own good, like if your sound is already good, you're like, my sound's not great. I'm using a $2 microphone or $5 lavalier mic. But if you're using your own sound suppression, like I do use an ASUS adapter. It's called ASUS AI noise canceling adapter, and it's like a USB-C adapter that I plug my mic into. So if you do not need or you do not want to use AMD noise suppression and you disable it in here, it is not completely disabled. And that's also part of why I think there's bugs. But basically, I found it in here in Task Scheduler. So open your Task Manager, go to Startup, and it's actually there as a task, and it's enabled. Even when you disable it in the driver, it says enabled for Startup, and right-click and obviously disable it. And that's... wait, I think I can disable that one too. I'm not using RT. I had like a weird audio driver issue at some point, and then it was coming up as trying to start itself as a service, but I'm not using it. And I didn't want to, like, I haven't bothered digging into Windows and deleting the service to do with Realtek Audio Universal Service. I'm not using that because what was happening is with the latest drivers on my motherboard, which is a B450, this is off topic. I'm just like going into this really quick. I was having an issue getting my audio UI to come up because after a Windows update, it updated my drivers to Universal Audio. And in Universal Audio, there was no audio control. Like this control panel was nowhere to be found. I couldn't find it in control panel. I couldn't find it, if I went into literal control panel, it was gone. Like there was no Realtek HD Audio Manager because the Realtek Universal Audio driver took over everything. And what I did was I went and found my driver, downloaded the Windows 10 version, and reinstalled it. And I got my Audio Manager back for loudness equalization to work, which is what I like to use just because. And yeah, just wanted to share that. That was just like a weird thing. Anyway, so now that you know all that, hope that helps some of you out. And just PM me if you need help. I'll do my best to help you out in the comments as well. And the video after this one, I'm actually going to run through every single game on my backlog. I've got like a ton of games installed that I haven't actually finished. I've been planning to, but I got kids and, life. But I wanted to just run through them all to show the driver stability after all the tweaks that I've done. And I will tell you now, if I deleted my MPT profile and tried to run full stock, my card's not stable. And I don't think my card actually has a problem. I just think the driver's reading it wrong and the BIOS on my card might be dated like it was an early BIOS that has the wrong max frequency, or something to do with, maybe it's intentional. It's meant to be able to boost up to 2800 megahertz, and it's just unstable. And then the driver just, some kind of driver incompatibility with the BIOS and aftermarket cards. And the thing is, do you blame AMD for that, or do you blame Gigabyte for that? Because technically, if Gigabyte are saying 2622 megahertz, the BIOS from the Gigabyte card should also be 2622. So it's a little bit weird there, but you can't modify the BIOS. Like, I don't know of a safe way to modify a 6000 series BIOS. Like Red BIOS editor, I'm not sure if that actually works. I haven't tried it with the newer generation cards. So anyway, thanks for watching, and yeah, look forward to the game test. I'm just going to literally clip a bunch of games together with the OSD open and show you what settings I'm running, just to show that they're running stable. Not really a mass benchmark, but just a mass demonstration of stable game stability across a range of games. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and if you enjoyed this, then please like and subscribe. And yeah, I'm not sure what else I can show you. This is just my details